Marilyn Monroe's body was never fully her own. Long before pills dominated her nights and exhaustion shaped her days, authority had already been assigned elsewhere. Doctors, studios, managers, and contracts all laid claim to her physical and emotional limits. Medicine was supposed to protect her. Instead, it became another system of control. This story is not about one reckless prescription. It is about power disguised as care. From the moment Marilyn entered Hollywood, her body was treated as a resource. Weight, energy, sleep, appearance, availability, everything was measured against productivity. When her natural rhythms failed to match the industry's demands, medicine stepped in as a solution. Not to heal her, to adjust her. Doctors were introduced early, not as independent advocates, but as extensions of the studio system. Their role was to keep her functioning, compliant, and camera-ready. Discomfort was not explored, it was corrected. Pain was not investigated, it was suppressed. This established a dangerous precedent. Marilyn learned that authority over her body came from outside herself. As her fame increased, so did the number of professionals involved in managing her health. What should have meant better care instead created fragmentation. Each doctor saw a version of Marilyn filtered through their specialty and agenda. One treated sleep. Another treated anxiety. Another focused on physical complaints intensified by stress. No one treated Marilyn as a whole. This division created a vacuum where responsibility dissolved. No single physician oversaw her complete medical picture. Prescriptions overlapped. Interactions went unmonitored. The assumption was that someone else was paying attention. This assumption would cost her life. Marilyn trusted doctors deeply. Authority figures had always shaped her survival. When doctors spoke with certainty, she listened. When they adjusted dosages, she complied. Questioning them felt unsafe. Obedience felt protective. Control does not always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as reassurance. Her doctors did not see themselves as controlling her. They saw her as difficult, fragile, emotionally volatile. This framing justified intervention. The more she struggled, the more authority they claimed over her treatment. Medication became not just therapy, but regulation. Her emotions were medicated rather than understood. What makes this story especially unsettling is how normalized it was. Marilyn's experience was not rare in old Hollywood. Many actors relied on doctors to manage exhaustion, anxiety, and sleep. The difference was intensity. Marilyn's sensitivity made her more vulnerable to both stress and medication. Instead of adapting the system to her needs, the system adapted her body to its demands. Her doctors communicated more with studios than with each other. Career considerations often influenced medical decisions. If Marilyn needed rest, medication was used to shorten recovery. If she needed energy, stimulants were prescribed to override fatigue. The body became something to be negotiated, not respected. Medical ethics blurred under pressure. As Marilyn's dependence on medication increased, her autonomy decreased. Decisions about her treatment were increasingly made without her full understanding of long-term consequences. Short-term solutions were prioritized repeatedly. Immediate performance mattered more than future health. This is how control becomes invisible. By the late 1950s, Marilyn's body was no longer responding predictably. Sleep medication no longer worked as intended. Anxiety returned stronger. Her doctors interpreted this not as a warning sign of overmedication, but as evidence that she needed more intervention. Escalation replaced caution. Each new prescription reinforced the belief that Marilyn could not manage herself. Her own perceptions were dismissed. Her discomfort was medicalized. Her resistance was pathologized. The more she expressed distress, the more authority others claimed over her body. This dynamic stripped her of agency, while convincing everyone involved that they were helping. The question at the heart of this story is not whether Marilyn needed medical care. She did. The question is who controlled that care and whose interests it ultimately served. Because by the time Marilyn Monroe's health began to collapse visibly, the system around her had already decided that her body was something to be managed, not listened to. And once that line was crossed, the outcome became dangerously predictable. As Marilyn Monroe's fame reached its peak, the circle of medical authority around her expanded quietly and relentlessly. What began as occasional treatment hardened into a permanent presence. Doctors were no longer called when something went wrong. They were embedded into her life as ongoing managers of her body, her sleep, her emotions, and her ability to function on demand. This is where care began to resemble control. Each physician entered Marilyn's life with a narrow focus and a sense of certainty. One specialized in sleep disorders. Another addressed anxiety. Another monitored physical complaints exacerbated by stress and exhaustion. Each viewed her symptoms through their own lens. None assumed responsibility for the full picture. This fragmentation created a dangerous illusion of safety. Because Marilyn was surrounded by professionals, everyone assumed she was protected. In reality, no one was coordinating her care. Her body became the intersection point of multiple medical decisions that never met. The more famous she became, the less autonomy she retained. Doctors communicated freely with studios, managers, and handlers. Marilyn's health was no longer private. It was logistical. If a production was delayed, her body was the obstacle. If a deadline loomed, her body was the variable to be adjusted. Medical decisions were influenced not by what she needed, but by what was required of her. Rest was treated as inefficiency, exhaustion as inconvenience. When Marilyn struggled to sleep, the response was chemical. When she struggled to wake, the response was chemical. When anxiety surfaced, it was subdued. When emotions overwhelmed her, they were flattened. Every natural signal her body sent was interpreted as malfunction rather than communication. This taught Marilyn a devastating lesson. Her instincts could not be trusted. Over time, doctors assumed increasing authority over her routines. When to sleep, how long, how deeply, how to wake, how to calm down, how to push through fatigue. Medication schedules replaced intuition. Instructions replaced agency. Control rarely announces itself as domination. It presents as structure. The imbalance of power was stark. Marilyn was emotionally vulnerable, deeply eager to please, and conditioned from childhood to defer to authority. Doctors occupied a position of unquestioned legitimacy. Their confidence filled the gaps left by her uncertainty. When they reassured her, she believed them. When they adjusted treatment, she complied. Trust became dependency. As her body adapted to repeated chemical intervention, symptoms intensified rather than resolved. Insomnia returned stronger. Anxiety sharpened. Emotional regulation became unstable. These were not signs of personal weakness. They were predictable consequences of long-term pharmacological interference. Yet her doctors did not interpret them that way. Instead, her reactions were framed as proof that she was inherently fragile. This justified further intervention, stronger medication, higher dosages, new combinations. Each escalation reinforced the narrative that Marilyn could not manage herself. The more medicine failed her, the more authority medicine claimed. By the late 1950s, Marilyn's treatment had become a maze of overlapping prescriptions. Some drugs were intended to counteract the side effects of others. Sedatives were followed by stimulants. Calm was followed by agitation. Sleep was followed by fog. Her nervous system was trapped in a cycle it could not escape. What made this especially dangerous was that Marilyn's doctors did not fully understand the cumulative effects of what they were prescribing. At the time, knowledge of long-term interactions was limited. Barbiturates were considered safe when used as directed. Chloral hydrate was still widely prescribed. The risks of polypharmacy were underestimated. But uncertainty did not lead to caution. Instead, it led to experimentation on a living body. Marilyn was not informed of the full risks. She was given reassurance instead of transparency. When she expressed fear about dependence, she was calmed rather than educated. When she questioned whether the pills were harming her, she was told they were necessary. Medical authority does not require coercion when trust is present. Her body began to show signs of strain. Memory gaps appeared. Concentration faltered. Mood swings intensified. Physical weakness followed emotional exhaustion. These symptoms were recorded but not integrated. Each doctor saw fragments and treated fragments. No one saw the system failing. The studios benefited from this arrangement. As long as Marilyn remained functional enough to perform, the deeper consequences were ignored. Doctors were praised for keeping her working. Delays were blamed on her temperament rather than on the chemical load she carried. Blame shifted downward. Marilyn internalized this blame. She believed she was failing despite receiving help. She believed her body was defective, that she required constant management to be acceptable. This belief eroded her confidence in her own perceptions. Once a person loses trust in their own body, control is complete. The line between treatment and compliance disappeared. Medication was no longer just about health. It was about regulation, about shaping behavior, about ensuring availability, about minimizing disruption. Her doctors may not have intended to control her, but intention did not change outcome. The system rewarded obedience and punished resistance. When Marilyn attempted to assert boundaries, she was labeled difficult. When she resisted medication, she was described as non-compliant. These labels justified further control. Medical language became a weapon. By the time Marilyn's condition visibly worsened, the system was too entrenched to change. Doctors defended their decisions. Studios defended their expectations. Everyone pointed elsewhere. And Marilyn, at the center of it all, was running out of physical resilience. Her body was no longer responding to rest, because rest had been chemically replaced. It was no longer responding to stress, because stress had been suppressed rather than resolved. Signals were dulled. Warnings were muted. This is the most dangerous stage of control. Because when the body stops warning, collapse comes without notice. Marilyn Monroe's doctors did not see themselves as controlling her body. They saw themselves as managing a problem. But in doing so, they removed her ability to listen to herself, to recover naturally, and to reclaim authority over her own physical limits. They controlled her not by force, but by routine. And by the time the consequences became undeniable, control had already replaced care. By the time Marilyn Monroe entered the final years of her life, the structure surrounding her medical care had hardened into something unrecognizable as healing. What once appeared as support had become surveillance. What once promised relief now enforced dependence. And what once belonged to her body no longer belonged to her. Accountability had vanished completely. There was no central authority overseeing Marilyn's treatment, no unified plan, no individual willing to say enough. Each doctor operated within a narrow boundary of responsibility, protected by plausible deniability. Prescriptions were written. Adjustments were made, concerns were noted, but no one stepped outside their lane to confront the system itself. This fragmentation ensured safety for everyone except Marilyn. As her symptoms worsened, the response was never reduction. It was escalation. If sleep medication failed, stronger sedatives were introduced. If sedation caused disorientation, stimulants were prescribed to counteract it. If emotional numbness followed, it was interpreted as psychological fragility rather than chemical overload. Her body was being pulled in opposite directions, simultaneously. The most dangerous aspect of this phase was normalization. Marilyn's instability was no longer alarming. It was expected. Her exhaustion was routine. Her confusion was familiar. When warning signs repeat often enough, they lose urgency. Collapse becomes background noise. Doctors continued to document her condition, but documentation did not translate into intervention. Symptoms were recorded without synthesis. Side effects were acknowledged without adjustment. Marilyn's complaints were reframed as emotional responses rather than physiological alarms. Medical language insulated decision-makers from consequence. The power imbalance widened further as Marilyn's confidence eroded. Years of being told she was fragile had reshaped her self-image. She deferred to authority even when frightened. She accepted instructions even when they conflicted. She trusted reassurances even when her body felt wrong. Control was complete not because she was forced, but because she no longer believed she could survive without it. Her doctors increasingly communicated with handlers rather than with her. Schedules were discussed. Availability was negotiated. Treatment plans were influenced by obligations rather than well-being. Marilyn became a logistical challenge rather than a patient. This is where medicine crosses into management. When Marilyn attempted to assert boundaries, those efforts were framed as instability. When she questioned dosages, it was interpreted as anxiety. When she resisted interventions, it was labeled noncompliance. Each attempt at autonomy was used as evidence that she required more control. Resistance justified restriction. At this stage, Marilyn's body was chemically conditioned. Natural sleep cycles were disrupted beyond repair. Her nervous system depended on external regulation. Removing medication abruptly would have been dangerous. Continuing it was equally perilous. She was trapped inside a medical paradox. The doctors surrounding her were not villains. They were products of an era that underestimated risk and overestimated authority. But intent does not negate impact. The outcome of their collective decisions was a body pushed beyond its capacity to recover. And no one stopped. Studios continued to apply pressure. Contracts loomed. Expectations remained unchanged. The system had no mechanism for compassion, only continuity. Marilyn's increasing isolation worsened the situation. Fewer trusted figures remained to advocate for her. Those who noticed danger lacked authority. Those with authority lacked urgency. This imbalance ensured inaction. Silence filled the gaps where intervention should have been. As her physical condition deteriorated, so did her emotional resilience. The pills that once allowed her to function now clouded her perception. Memory lapses became frequent. Tracking dosages grew difficult. Instructions blurred. The margin for error narrowed to nothing. In such a state, oversight was critical. It was absent. No consistent caregiver monitored her intake closely enough to intervene. No single physician took responsibility for coordinating treatment. No safeguard existed to prevent accumulation or interaction. Marilyn lived in a constant state of chemical risk without informed consent. This is systemic failure. What makes this phase especially disturbing is that it was avoidable. Reduction could have been attempted earlier. Coordination could have been enforced. Boundaries could have been respected. But the system prioritized function over safety. The body was expected to adapt endlessly. Marilyn's doctors continued to believe they were helping. This belief protected them from confronting the reality that they were perpetuating harm. Acknowledging failure would have required dismantling the very authority they relied upon. So nothing changed. By the time Marilyn's health reached a critical threshold, intervention would have required radical disruption, complete reevaluation, withdrawal under supervision, rest without pressure. These options conflicted with contractual obligations and institutional convenience. Convenience 1. Marilyn Monroe did not lose control of her body suddenly. Control was transferred gradually, prescription by prescription, reassurance by reassurance, until autonomy was replaced by routine. Her body became a site of experimentation, management, and neglect. And the system that claimed to care for her ensured that when collapse finally came, no one would be held responsible. Because responsibility had been diluted beyond recognition. In the final stretch of Marilyn Monroe's life, the illusion of medical order collapsed completely. What remained was a fragile body sustained by routine, dependency, and silence. The system that surrounded her did not tighten its grip in response to danger. It loosened, and in that looseness, everything slipped. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn's physical state was no longer stable. Her sleep was artificial, induced rather than restorative. Her waking hours were fragmented, interrupted by fatigue, confusion, and emotional volatility. The boundary between night and day had dissolved. Her body no longer recognized its own signals. This was not sudden. It was the predictable outcome of years of chemical interference. Her doctors continued to adjust medications without addressing the root problem, the body's inability to recover. Each adjustment treated a symptom created by a previous treatment. A cycle had formed, and no one knew how to stop it without risking collapse. That risk became the excuse for inaction. Marilyn was now fully dependent on medical guidance she could not question. Instructions arrived fragmented. Prescriptions overlapped. The margin for error was razor-thin. One missed dose caused panic. One extra pill invited catastrophe. In this state, the concept of control was meaningless. She was being maintained, not healed. The final weeks revealed the deepest flaw in the system, the absence of responsibility at the moment it mattered most. When Marilyn showed signs of extreme distress, no emergency protocol activated. When she withdrew, no coordinated response followed. When she isolated, the system interpreted it as routine behavior. Danger had become familiar. Her doctors trusted that the structure they had built would hold. They trusted routines. They trusted assumptions. They trusted that what had not yet failed would continue not to fail. That trust was misplaced. On the night her body finally gave out, there was no single decision that caused it. No dramatic error. No obvious line crossed. What occurred was the cumulative result of countless unchecked actions, layered over years. This is why accountability vanished. The medications in her system were not administered by a single hand. They were prescribed across time, across contexts, across intentions. Each doctor could point to a moment where their involvement seemed reasonable. Each decision, isolated, appeared defensible. Together, they were lethal. When Marilyn was found unresponsive, the narrative formed quickly. It needed to. Systems protect themselves instinctively. The focus shifted away from long-term medical control and toward immediate circumstance. Labels were applied. Conclusions were drawn. The deeper story remained untouched. No serious reckoning followed. No institutional review. No structural reform. The medical framework that failed Marilyn continued unchanged, ready to repeat itself with the next vulnerable body under pressure. Her doctors returned to their practices. Their authority remained intact, their reputations untouched. Marilyn Monroe became the cautionary tale instead of the system. What history often misses is that Marilyn did not lose control because she was weak. She lost control because she trusted expertise that did not protect her. She complied with systems that did not prioritize her humanity. She followed instructions in a world that equated obedience with care. Her body became the battleground between productivity and preservation. And productivity always won. The tragedy lies not only in her death, but in the normalization of her suffering beforehand. Warning signs were visible long before the end. Dependency was evident. Deterioration was measurable. Yet intervention never arrived, because intervention would have disrupted too many interests. Disruption was unacceptable. Marilyn's story forces an uncomfortable question. Where does medical authority end, and where does exploitation begin? When treatment sustains function at the expense of life, is it care or control? No answer was ever offered. In the aftermath, her image froze in time. Glamour eclipsed reality. The suffering body was erased in favor of the icon. The pills disappeared from the narrative. The doctors faded into footnotes. Responsibility dissolved into myth. But the truth remains embedded in the pattern. Marilyn Monroe did not die simply because of drugs. She died because no one stopped the system that controlled her body long before it stopped her heart. She was surrounded by professionals. She was monitored, medicated, observed. And yet, when it mattered most, she was alone. This is the quiet horror of institutional failure. It does not look like violence. It looks like routine. Marilyn trusted the people who controlled her body. That trust cost her autonomy, and in the end, it cost her life. The question is not whether her doctors intended harm. The question is why no one took responsibility when harm became inevitable. And that question remains unanswered.